Fredericksburg deemed itself to be more of a moderate kind of place, did not immediately support secession. In fact, the person who was assigned to vote at the Virginia Secession Convention was chosen specifically because he did not support secession, because his belief was that the institution of slavery would be best protected by remaining in the Union. Now, of course, as the secession crisis moves forward with the bombing of Fort Sumter, after Lincoln's call for the draft, these feelings start to change and get more extreme. Whereas once the thought was amongst a lot of the moderates in town that the Union would be the safest place to be, people are beginning to think otherwise. There's an editorial, newspaper editorial from the time, and I'll read a little bit of that. It says, quote, "What should Virginia do? Can any one of her true sons doubt? Let her not lose a day in abandoning the polluting tie that connects her with such a government." When we think about that language, think about calling to, one, just appealing to people's hearts, right? The true sons of Virginia must believe in abandoning this polluting tie to the United States. This is a very different perspective that evolved over a pretty short period of time. And ultimately, Marie does switch his vote in the Virginia Secession Convention, like many of the people at the Secession Convention. And by the time there's a vote in town, very few Fredericksburgers are willing to still maintain that more moderate position. And Fredericksburg overwhelmingly, at least Fredericksburg's white male population, because those are the only people voting, vote for secession. So, after this dramatic event, how do Fredericksburgers, I love saying that, by the way, it's really fun. How do Fredericksburgers perceive their own lives changing? What do they expect is going to happen? Of course, there's not one answer to this. People expect lots of different things based on who they are and where they come from. There are a lot of people who live here who understand that there's a real chance for war, but also that the war, they see it as potentially the only chance to maintain the status quo that they were protecting. There are some who are concerned about the war. James Honeycutt is a local unionist in town. He writes, quote, "The work of war and death, once commenced, will diffuse itself everywhere and into all classes." So you can sense the full range of feelings about what is coming to this town.
It was not uncommon for the citizenry of Fredericksburg to find maybe over 100 U.S. soldiers in their congregations, perhaps even more soldiers than there were local congregants at some times. Jane Beale, who I mentioned earlier, the Fredericksburg diarist, went out of her way to mention in June that she went to church, she went to the Presbyterian church again, found over 100 U.S. soldiers sitting in the pews, and wondered to herself if she could stomach being in the presence of so many Yankees for so long, but found herself pleasantly surprised that the U.S. soldiers were quiet, respectful, and reverent, and attentive during the sermon. She went on to hope that exposure to Southern pastors would convince the Yankee soldiers of the evilness of their cause. A couple weeks later, when she heard about the early federal plans to begin arming some African Americans as soldiers, her response to that was to declare that the entire northern section of the country and the federal government must be controlled by Satan. While they might have been able to come to church together to a certain degree of harmony, they did not necessarily take the same lessons from that experience. In general, interestingly enough, you might assume sort of the classic story is that people with great differences between each other come together, are forced to interact with each other for a significant period of time, and come that they are more alike than they are different in an understanding forms. And while a certain degree of quiet formed, not necessarily, unfortunately, an understanding. In some ways, the experience for many of these Wisconsin men, while they had perhaps seen more of the country than the people of Fredericksburg, they certainly had had no direct experiences in many cases with the American South. Their time here at Fredericksburg and their interactions with the people of Fredericksburg would be, for many of these northern men, their first experiences in any real meaningful way with people of the South. And as we heard from Captain Henry here, he did not come away particularly impressed. In many ways, the U.S. soldiers and the citizenry came away from their experiences, almost having many of their pre-war prejudices and biases in some ways reinforced. The U.S. soldiers felt that they were treated unfairly by the local population, treated with derision and hostility for things that they weren't actually doing, even as they were actively protecting Southern property, including the property of men who were in the Confederate Army who were shooting at their brothers in arms at that very moment. Meanwhile, the people of Fredericksburg saw only a hostile invading army, cutting them off from the rest of the Confederacy, disrupting, if not destroying, the very things they saw themselves as fighting for. Chief among them, as Miss Beale stated quite regularly in her diary, was the status and obediency of the city's enslaved
Now,
population.
the first year of the war, the people of Fredericksburg do experience some hardships, some shortages. There's a Confederate occupation force that arrives in town, but largely the Confederate occupation force, though it disrupts life a little bit, it also maintains the status quo in Fredericksburg. It's not until the spring of 1862, when the Union Army arrives here, that you have Fredericksburg's civilians and these soldiers that we've been talking about meet face to face. And as we see them clashing, you see they're very distinct groups of people with different ideas about the war, different ideas about what's at stake. And you see how that plays out over the summer of 1862.